Hi, folks, and welcome to the lectures for this week. So we've covered a decent amount of ground in our time together thus far. Duels, wars, revolutions, slavery, angry young white men with guns, the fate of indigenous peoples. One thing we haven't spent a lot of time talking about is the realm of culture, right? Arts, music, literature, songs, all of the things that go into making the cultural fabric of a nation. To the extent that I've talked about culture thus far, it was in the context of an emergent Black culture or African American culture in the United States, one that is nurtured in the quarters of enslaved peoples, oftentimes on these larger plantations where you have a kind of critical mass of enslaved people who are melding things they bring with them or that their ancestors brought with them from Africa with indigenous traditions, with European traditions, and creating this kind of hybrid culture that has in part serves as a way of resisting, but essentially takes on a life of its own as a kind of rich, particular thread in the fabric of a larger American culture. Um, the other sort of culture I talked about um, has to do with drinking, right? It was inside the bars and pubs that Americans nurtured much of the political culture that ended up exploding during the Revolution. And in the 19th century, bars and saloons became the center of a new working class culture that helped bound together the workers of industrial America, right? The folks I talked about in the lectures last week who work in these factories, they get together after work. I mean, they drink during work many times, but they also get together after work at the bar to complain about the boss, right? And to complain about, their lives and to commiserate and to comfort each other. And there is a kind of culture that comes out of that, particularly male what we call homosocial, meaning kind of male bonds of friendship that come out of the working class drinking culture. But I have been told by those who would know better than I do that simply having a pint or six down at the local watering hole isn't the only kind of culture that you can partake in. And what I want to do for you today is to highlight for you some of the connections between the political, economic, and social developments that I've been talking about with you and that you've been reading about and discussing in your sections for the last several weeks, to culture, and try to show you some links between changes in American culture over the course of the early Republic and some of these larger political and economic issues. Um, So culture, art, and nationalism are entwined from the very beginning of the American story. And in fact, before we even have an independent United States. In 1771, the American-born poet Philip Freneau and Hugh Henry Brackenridge, a Scottish-born immigrant who'd come to the United States, addressed their graduating class at Princeton University. Right, this is a kind of a valedictory address. And the theme of their address was the rising glory of America. He said, "This is the land of every joyous sound where the arts shall rise and grow." Um, this was essentially a kind of American cultural nationalism, the idea that, hey, even before we're a nation, that there is a distinctly American culture that is going to nurture a particularly American form of the arts. Now, this was a bold prediction at a time when most educated Americans looked eastward, back across the Atlantic, to England and to Europe, as the font of culture, arts, and learning. What kind of art could possibly come out of this primitive backwater colony, right? That was the attitude of most American elites all the way through the colonial period. And Freneau and Breckinridge are essentially pushing against that tide. Um, Indeed, the very first American artist or to gain any sort of success sort of internationally was a guy named Benjamin West, who you see a portrait of up on the top left there. And he achieved his fame primarily through the painting you're looking at here, The Death of General Wolfe, which was painted in 1770. And this is the subject of this painting is what Americans would call the French and Indian War, what the English would call the 7 Years' War. and it's a celebration of the sacrifice of General Wolfe, who had helped been leading the British and American campaign against the hated Catholic French during that war. Um, this is a strikingly nationalist painting, but it is a British nationalism that it's celebrating. Right? It's celebrating. Yes, there are Americans in here, but there are Americans arm in arm with the British, celebrating a British victory over the French and the sacrifices therein. And it's not surprising that Wolfe eventually ended up leaving America and settling in England around the time of the Revolutionary War. John Singleton Copley was another famous early American painter and portraitist. And he also ended up, not coincidentally, leaving for England during the Revolutionary War because he was himself very much of a loyalist. And in some ways, it shouldn't be surprising that two of our most famous early American cultural sort of icons, the artists, ended up leaving America and living in Britain. To educated Americans, certainly prior to the Revolutionary War, culture tended to be synonymous with British culture. So, why would you stay in the sticks? Why would you stay in these backwater ass colonies when you can make it big in London, right? All the people you admired, all of the famous artists you looked up to, all of the people who you wanted to emulate, they were all back in England. You weren't trying to emulate your fellow Americans. These guys can't paint for shit. I want to be a famous English painter. So the first famous early American artist who didn't choose to identify himself primarily with England was a guy named Charles Wilson Peale. And again, you see his portrait here. And Peale was an avowed American nationalist. And his greatest contribution to early American arts and culture was not necessarily his paintings. He did paint, um, but rather a gallery. He puts together a public gallery in Philadelphia that begins displaying portraits of famous Americans, folks like Washington and Jefferson. Think of this sort of as an early version of the Hall of Presidents, right? And it was harnessing art, portraits in the service of American nationalism, right? Here are the portraits of the great men, and they were men, who helped found our republic, right? Um, in a development that is going to characterize early art and American culture as a whole, what started out as a kind of portrait gallery of famous Americans quickly grew into a museum that was stuffed to the rafters with this kind of odd collections of curios drawn from art, natural history, archaeology, um, and essentially from all over the place. So, what you see here on the left is the self-portrait of the artist in his museum, right? And you can see, in the back, there's some paintings, but you also see like some dinosaur bones here and a stuffed turkey. And in addition to what you see here, Peale's museum included a variety of stuffed and mounted animals, as well as fish, snakes, and insects, a collection of minerals, fossils, and shells, ethnographic exhibits focusing on the clothing and sort of material culture of Native Americans, the picture gallery of American patriots, but also a whole kind of zoo full of live animals. There was a botanical exhibit featuring rare trees and plants. There was electrical and technological equipment, including a model of a perpetual motion machine, as well as a mounted figure of a five-legged, double-tailed cow giving milk to a two-headed cow. Part science, part art, part kind of just sheer monument to American nationalism, and part just, hey, look at this two-headed cow, right? This was in many ways very characteristic of what American culture was like in this period. And in fact, after Peale dies, his entire museum and collection are bought by the entertainer P.T. Barnum, who we know from circuses, and he became Barnum's American Museum. This museum was, in fact, a characteristic of American culture from the foundation of the Republic through maybe the mid-19th century in its tendency to mix together what we would now call high art, like portraits by famous artists, and popular culture, right? The two-headed cow. right? The kind of things you would see at a fairgrounds mixed together in the same building, in the same room in some cases, with what we would call high art that you would normally see in a kind of uh, hoity-toity art gallery. Um, The other thing that's characteristic of American culture is that this museum was strongly overlaid with a kind of coat of nationalism, right? And it's most obviously visible in the portrait gallery of famous Americans, but there's also a certain amount of pride here in like, hey, look at all this cool stuff we got. Like, look at America. We're cool. We got George Washington. We got Thomas Jefferson. We got this two-headed cow. Check it out, right? Um, American culture in this period was highly, highly nationalist. And that's reflected in museums. It's also reflected in print culture. Probably the most vibrant area of early American culture in the New Year's Republic was in the realm of the printed word. And in part, this has to do with the relatively high literacy rates that prevailed in the United States. I mentioned in New England in the early 19th century, um, because of this legacy of, hey, you want everyone to know how to read the Bible, because unlike under Catholicism, where you get your most important information from your priest, who sort of tells you what to, tells you on Sundays, hey, here's a few you should pay attention to. Under Protestantism and Puritanism, the idea is that you need to have a direct relationship with God, and the only mediator there should be the Bible, right? And so you need to learn how to read, if for nothing else, read the Bible. So 90% literacy rate in New England, but even out on the frontier, about 2/3 of males were literate. There are some distinctions here, obviously, between men and women. There is, some encouragement of female literacy for reasons of wanting to be able to educate children. There's class differences here, obviously. The more money your family has, the more likely you are to be literate. But compared to other countries around the world, the United States is quite literate at this point. Um, and you see examples of this. For example, we talked about during the Revolutionary War, um, Tom Paine's famous pamphlet "Common Sense." Um, the majority of bestsellers in what is to become the United States during the Revolutionary War period were actually political pamphlets. Common Sense is probably the most important, but Tom Paine writes a whole bunch of other pamphlets that are hugely bestsellers. And so in politics, it makes sense. And when you're going through a revolution, when you're going through a period of political turmoil, people want to read about it and talk about it. And if you're literate, you can read about it. And so literary culture in the early years of the Republic, during the Revolution, and then after independence, is focused to a large degree around political literature. During the post-revolutionary years, there's an enormous outpouring of books and magazines in cities and places like New York. Um, you see a number of bookstores, you see publishers springing up, and perhaps even more significantly, because of the market revolution, right? Because of the fact that the expanding countryside or frontier is now being linked by canals and roads and railroads to places in New York. It creates not only a unified national market, but part of that market now is for books and magazines, and it lays the foundation for a national culture through the distribution of books, magazines, newspapers, and pamphlets. So instead of like people in the frontier are reading one thing because it's the thing that's printed locally, and then people in New York are reading another. Increasingly, we begin to see the beginnings of a kind of national print culture in which people in New York are reading the same things as the people in frontier Tennessee, right? There's obviously local newspapers. There's still a local scene. But on top of that, layered on top of your local newspaper, you would have pamphlets and books that are being read all across the country and are beginning to create the foundations for a kind of unified national culture. And I showed you this graph earlier about number of published newspapers. This is about literacy. It's also about people suddenly caring about what's happening in the world once their lives are connected to the rest of the world through the market revolution. And one practical consequence of this, right? I remember that leading up to this duel with Andrew Jackson and Charles Dickinson, Andrew Jackson took out an ad in a Tennessee newspaper, saying mean things about Charles Dickinson. So this shows some of the overlap between politics, between culture, and this, in case, has some very real world consequences for both Andrew Jackson and particularly for Charles Dickinson, who ends up dead. As in the Revolutionary period, nationalism and nation building are an incredibly important part of the kind of literary culture of the early republic. The single best-selling publication of the late 1700s in America was Noah Webster's American Spelling Book, which is selling something like 200,000 copies annually. Um, Now, it's not the most interesting read, right? It's a spelling book. But it also serves a very real political and ideological purpose for the new nation. Because, back across the pond, back across the Atlantic, the British had forever made fun of Americans, not only for their stupid, dumb, low-class backcountry accent, like who the hell talks like that, but also for the kind of distinctive way in which Americans had come to use the English language, right? In practice, American English had come to diverge in some ways from the way it was spoken back and written back in England. Right? It sort of makes sense. You've got these divergent, there's a big ocean between them. Um, and with his first spelling book, Webster launched a lifelong campaign for kind of institutionalizing a particular American form of English and giving it a kind of legitimacy. All of this culminated in Webster's kind of crowning work, which was his American Dictionary of the English Language, published in 1828. And the title there is revealing, right? He's staking a claim there in the title for a distinctive American form of English that is going to be institutionalized in these publications, right? It's not something we should be embarrassed of as Americans. And in fact, he argues that American English could improve on, rather than trying to emulate or ape English as it's spoken back in England, we should improve upon it. And specifically, he says, we should be more democratic and inclusive in the way that we structure our language. And one way to do that is that we should change the spellings to make them easier. Right? If any of you, if any of you particularly who had to learn English as a second language, or if you know anybody who's trying to learn English as a second language, it's a real pain in the ass. And one of the reasons it's a pain in the ass is that words in English, their spelling oftentimes doesn't really directly correspond to how you say them, right? So you may know how to say a particular word, but then you go to spell it and you're like, what? That's how you spell that? That makes no sense. And so Webster looks at this and says, you know what? We should democratize this language, make it easier to understand by revising the spelling of all of our words to make it be spelled the way it sounds. Or as he would say, there is no alternative, right? Let's get rid of these extraneous spellings and spell them in a way that makes them easier to learn, right? Um, this is a product, just as Americans improved on the English form of government, right? We're going to improve on the English language. Now, eventually he walks, this is a very ambitious project to kind of restructure the spelling of every single word, not every single word, but most words, a lot of words, right? Eventually he walks this back. But we do still have some legacy of that. So for example, in England, they put an extra U in the word labor. You don't say that U, it just happens to be there. And we took it out because why? You don't need that U. Same with color, right? Um, Webster's spelling book was the first in a series of textbooks that would go on to include grammar and other things that are designed not simply to teach people how to spell or how to use grammar, but to calculate a sense of national pride in us as a people. Um, and this is a conscious political project for Webster. America must be as independent in literature as she is in politics, as famous for arts as for arms. Right? Anyway, this is not unique to America. A lot of emerging nations, one of the things they first tried to do, particularly when they were former colonial nations, is to try to sort of sketch out an independent path for themselves, not just politically, but culturally. And whether they're coming out of the French control or British control, or Portuguese or Spanish control, oftentimes new nations are looking to chart not just political independence, but linguistic independence and cultural independence. Now, one of the other most popular forms of literature in the early republic was history. Uh, uh, Politics is an important thing, but particularly as we get past the revolution, history becomes a really, really popular form of literature. Not just something that academics read, not something you just read in class, but History was kind of popular entertainment. Um, and from the very beginning, history in this country, the writing of history in this country was deeply tied up both in nationalism and also in the politics of the era. If you listen today, you watch your Fox News or you listen to the president, you will hear laments about how history is so politicized and partisan. That historians have historians like me, particularly academic historians, have an axe to grind. And the reason that I talk so much about slavery and the working class and riots is because I'm some kind of fucking communist, which you don't care. Um, but the thing is, history in this country, the writing of history in this country, was politicized from the very beginning. And in fact, arguably, history was more directly politicized in the early years of the Republic than it is now. Um, and the history, as it was written in the early Republic, reflected a very specific political debate. And it was the debate going back to that between Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans and Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, right? And just remember that the Federalists want a strong federal government. People need to be the common people need to be led by great men, and we need to protect people not just from the government but from themselves. Jefferson wants small government, wants diffused local power, and believes that the primary thing we need protection from is the tyranny of kings and or an all too powerful president. So that's a political debate that roils the early republic. Well, that debate flows over into the early histories that are written of the Revolutionary War, because of course the most popular kind of history that's being both written and consumed in this period are histories of the Revolution. Right? It just happened; it's a recent event, but people want to read about it. They want to read about this thing that just happened. This really important moment, the birth of a new country. So when Federalist historians, when people who are of the Federalist persuasion write histories of the Revolution, they stress the role of great men like George Washington. Um, and they do so in part as part of a political campaign, right? And the idea, the implication is great men like Washington are the ones who brought us this victory. And therefore, they are also the natural leaders of the new republic. Much as we looked to Washington to deliver us from the British, we should look to Washington now, or to Adams, or to me, Alexander Hamilton, or whatever, to be the leaders of this new republic, right? So the great man theory of history that underlines a federalist history of the revolution is closely tied to the kind of political program. Now, historians who are more of a Jeffersonian bent, when they write about the revolution, they tend to not write about how great George Washington is, but rather they'll stress the role of the common people. They'll say, what really won the war wasn't George Washington. It was the Minutemen. It was the average folks who are out in the streets, dumping tea in the harbor, or the common soldier, right? And this is on the one hand a way of understanding the revolution. Right? It's about saying, hey, if you want to understand why we won the revolution, you should look to common people. But it's also a prescription for how you run the country, right? Hey, it wasn't great men who won the revolution. It was the common people. And therefore, in this new republic, the governing should be devolved as much as possible upon common people, right? This is about history, but it's also very transparently and nakedly about the political debates of the era. Um, History as an enterprise is never apolitical, right? Um, that because people who write histories have politics, and it's inevitable that those politics will come out in the way that they write history, and the way I give you lectures, right? My politics infuse these lectures. We are all working ideally from a common set of facts. We're ideally not making things up to support our politics, but how we understand those facts, the way that we relate them back to you, is of course shaped by my politics. And in this way, it was very naked, right? There was not even an attempt really to say, oh no, I'm unbiased. No, the Jeffersonian history a Jeffersonian would write a Jeffersonian history of the revolution in the same way that a federalist would write an avowedly federalist history of the revolution. Now, All of the names I have mentioned here for you thus far have belonged to men, and that is not an accident or a coincidence, right? I've already said for you on a number of occasions that early America was a country in which women were treated, systematically as second-class citizens, as appendages of their fathers and husbands, and they were generally discouraged from the kind of politically charged cultural and artistic expressions that dominated the life of the early republic. Women are not supposed to be artists or authors. They're supposed to be wives and mothers, right? To raise children and take care of their husband's needs. Um, I did mention for you, though, that there are some changes stirring, right? And going back to this notion of Republican motherhood and the notion that, hey, even if we don't think women should be independent, they need to be educated enough and literate enough so they can pass that knowledge on to their male offspring, right? Because women are usually given the task of raising children. We need to educate them just enough so that they can pass that along to their male offspring, right? But education is a hard thing to contain, right? Education can be subversive. Education can serve purposes not intended by those who are teaching it to you or giving it to you. And so, increasingly, as women's literacy rates um, approach that of men, so by 1830, we have roughly equal uh, literacy rates among men and women. Many women read these political texts and take the lesson that, hey, that stuff should apply to me, right? So as early as 1790, this is before Republican motherhood really takes off, but as early as 1790, you have Judith Sargent Murray, who is, probably the first avowed feminist in American history, write this book called this essay on the equality of the sexes, in which she makes a very straightforward argument for equality between men and women, right? And we saw in the last lecture how economic changes, in which men are essentially, in many cases, are capable of being the sole breadwinner for the family. And women are increasingly, working outside the house and bringing money back into the household. That's threatening structures of patriarchy. And education too has the capacity to kind of build a resistance to patriarchy. And we'll see all this, particularly by the late 19th century. Really, this is more a subject for the next class for History 17. We see these movements coming together in the form of an organized feminist movement as we get to the second half of the 19th century. All right, so if we were to summarize for you, what is culture? What is American culture in the early republic? So roughly 1783 through the 1820s. Well, it's nationalist. It's very, whatever the form, whether it's literature, whether it's art, whether it's your two-headed calf, it tends to be very nationalist. And again, that's not at all unusual in a new nation, in an emerging nation, in a post-colonial nation. There's a desire to have your culture also render you independent. It's eclectic, like much like Peale's museum, right? It's all kind of jumbled together. It is nakedly and avowedly political, as we saw in the discussion of the histories of the Revolutionary War. And here, a final point that is going to be important as we proceed to the next part of this lecture is that culture in the early republic um, was aimed, virtually all of it was aimed at a mass audience, at least a mass audience of white people. Um, and that there was very little separation between what we would today call high and either low or pop culture, right? Today we're familiar with the notion of like, hey, there's like quote unquote high culture, like like the novels of, I don't know, like James Joyce or whatever, or opera, or like a play that you would go see at a fancy playhouse. There's a contrast between that kind of high culture and going to see the new Marvel movie, right? Or watching something on Netflix, right? There's high culture and there's popular culture, and those are distinct. Um, Peale's Museum is a perfect example of how in the early republic, that distinction really didn't exist. You would see things in that museum that we would call high culture, but you would also see a two-headed calf, right? And rich people and poor people, working class, middle class, they're all going to the same museums in this period. And the idea of a working class person going to a museum wasn't at all unusual, right? It wasn't like, oh, museums are for rich people. That there's very little distinction in American culture in the early republic between high culture and pop culture. So that is going to start to change. And it's a change that goes along with some of the political and economic changes that I outlined for you last time with the rise of working class culture. And the story that I'm going to tell you today to illustrate that um, comes from a book called Highbrow, Lowbrow: The Emergence of Cultural Hierarchy in America, by an amazing historian. He's since passed on. He was one of my professors at Berkeley, but Lawrence Levine. He was a long-term professor at UC Berkeley. And if this is something that at all interests you, I really urge you to pick up this book. It's very readable. But I'm going to give you kind of one story drawn from this book. Um, and so to start, I need to tell you something that you may find difficult to believe. And that is that in 19th century America, particularly in the first half of the 19th century, Shakespeare was wildly popular. And I don't mean popular as in a lot of people knew who he was or pretended to have read him in high school or whatever, had to write an essay on Shakespeare. And so they, of course, they read one of the plays because they had to do it in high school. No, I mean popular as in popular entertainment. Shakespeare was the equivalent of like, the Marvel movie franchise or, I haven't updated the slide in a while. Sorry, pop culture references at least 3 or 4 years out of date. But Shakespeare's pop culture, it's mass culture. Um, and if you've been listening closely, you'll realize that seems to contradict something I've already said, which is that American culture is very nationalist, right? And Shakespeare, as y'all I hope know, Shakespeare is not American. He's also quite dead by this period, but he's British, right? Um, and so why is it that Americans who are so nationalist are so into Shakespeare, who's this British dude? Um, well, part of what's going on is Shakespeare is essentially Americanized. And I had some examples of this during my lifetime that I'll point to. You all are up with the pop culture of today. You may have some more recent ones, but I'm actually old enough to remember when U2, the band U2, was known as an Irish band because that's where they're from. They're Irish. Over the years, as they became more successful, they in many ways kind of Americanized themselves, right? So that picture there is Bono, lead singer of U2, performing at the Super Bowl, the most American of all possible things, with an American flag jacket, right? When you think about U2, you might realize, if you think about all of them, you might know they're from Ireland, but they don't scream Irish band. They're a part of American pop culture, right? From my parents' generation, that would be the Rolling Stones, right? The Rolling Stones are a British band, and you probably, oh, right, no, it's just British. But they're also a huge fixture in American popular culture. They've also played the Super Bowl, right? So these are examples of British cultural phenomenons that Americanized themselves. Now, of course, Shakespeare's dead by the 19th century, and so he can't go on theater tours of the Midwest and say nobody rocks like Cleveland or whatever and Americanize himself. So how is Shakespeare Americanized, right? How does this English cultural figure get so thoroughly accepted and integrated into a very nationalist American cultural milieu? And the answer to that is largely in how it was presented. So I'll just give you one example of this. 1964, Barnum's American Museum, which is the descendant of Charles Peale's museum, hosted a benefit concert that was aiming to raise money for a Shakespeare statue, right? And again, this just gives you a kind of example of how popular he is. A P.T. Barnum, the sort of populist entertainer who is mostly associated with circuses, is raising money for a Shakespeare statue. And so what do they do to do that? Well, they stage a version of The Taming of the Shrew, famous Shakespeare play. But they also feature on the same bill as The Taming of the Shrew, colossal giants, an infant drummer, 3 albino children, a tableau of moving wax figures, a monster serpent, and a musically educated seal, right? That's how you Americanize Shakespeare. You present him in this cultural milieu in which everything is all sort of blended together, right? That, yeah, I love The Taming of the Shrew, but I also want to see this damn seal, dude. This seal, you see the seal? It's dropping some bars, right? And in fact, theater in the first half, particularly of the 19th century, and Shakespeare in particular, was a very democratic institution, meaning that it presented material that was designed to appeal to everybody, right? We think of theater now as something that is, you maybe go to as part of a school as part of like a school field trip. But in general, at least when I think about theater, I think about rich people, upper middle class people who are, going to dress up nice and go to the theater, right? I have kind of visceral reaction against the theater. I don't go hang out with fancy people. I don't want to wear nice clothes. That's not what theater was in the first half of the 19th century, and it absolutely wasn't what Shakespeare was. Theater was this thing where everybody went. It was a kind of, you went and you may not all sit in the same seats, right? Like the rich folks are going to get the nice box seats maybe, and the working class are all going to be down on the floor. But rich, poor, working class, middle class, upper class, the factory owner and the factory worker are all going to the same theaters to watch the same play. They all love Shakespeare, and maybe a musically educated seal, right? Not only that, there was not always a lot of separation between the audience and the performers. So just give you one example. In Christmas of 1832, around the Christmas season, they're doing a special Christmas presentation of Richard III, the play Richard III, at New York Bowery Theater. And you get this huge holiday crowd, and they end up selling more tickets than there are seats. And so the crowd overflows onto the stage. And so while the performers are performing, the crowd's up on the stage, and they're walking around the stage, and they're picking up the props while the play is going on, sort of hefting the swords. There's a kind of climactic battle sequence, and when the roll of drums and the blast of trumpets goes off for there to be this battle sequence, the audience participates, and the audience gets up and runs across the stage with the performers to simulate this battle. And there's a climactic fight at the end of Richard III between Richard and Richmond. And when that happens, the audience gathers around them, forms a circle around them, and like cheers them on like it's a street fight, right? And what's interesting about this is this was all done in perfectly good humor. This was not an attempt to disrupt the play. And the performers were totally fine with it, right? It was like, hey, we all love Shakespeare, and it's the holidays, and like, what's more cool than like being up on the stage with your favorite performers? And the performers think it's great too. It's like, hey, the audience is so into this shit that they're up here with us, right? It's an example of how kind of populist Shakespeare in particularly was as a cultural form. So Shakespeare hugely popular, and the most popular American Shakespearean actor of this period was a guy named Edward Forrest. Born in Philadelphia, he makes his acting debut in 1820. And his acting style was described by some as heroic or more physical than subtle. And what that really means is he's a kind of, oh, look, that's bad. I don't want that. He's an action hero, right? He plays Shakespeare, and again, that's not when you think of Shakespeare, you don't think of action heroes, but the way he plays these roles, the roles he's cast in, he plays them, he hands it up, he chews the scenery, and he plays them as action heroes. He plays them as these, I'm not here for the fine nuances of this line. I'm here to strut around this stage and be badass as fuck in this Shakespeare play, right? And Forrest is beloved by the working class in America, right? And remember, the working class, as we're beginning to get the development of a distinctly American working class as we go through the early part of the 19th century, they're still going to the theater in this period. Yes, there's a working class now, but they still love Shakespeare. They still love the theater, and they love Forrest. And they love him in part because he's fun, right? He has fun with it. He's up there hamming it up and chewing the scenery and swinging his sword around. They also love him because he's fiercely nationalistic, right? They call him the Andrew Jackson of the stage, both for his kind of physical exploits and also because he's fiercely nationalistic. And one of the ways he expresses that nationalism is through the public abuse of his British stage rivals. Right? He's an American Shakespearean actor. He publicly talks acres of shit about British Shakespearean actors. And his particular target is this guy, William Charles Macready. So Macready is the preeminent British Shakespearean actor of the day. And he is also the favored Shakespearean actor of the emerging American elite, right? So that top 1%, the folks who own the factories, they still love Shakespeare. They love Shakespeare too. But you're beginning to see some divergence here. And they both love Shakespeare, working class and the upper class. But working class Americans love Forrest and his kind of rough and tumble style of Shakespeare. Upper class is like, Forrest, yeah, that's fine for you. You're working class, great, you go enjoy that. But we We cultured people, we American elites, we want a more refined Shakespeare. And that is McReady. McReady is a very refined, kind of upper class, dignified Shakespearean actor, right? And he's famed for having a little cape that he wears. And when he comes on stage, he does a little twirl with his little cape, right? Um, and McGreedy and Forrester become huge rivals, right? And you can think about like the contrast between someone like a Hugh Grant, right, a kind of foppish, stuttering British aristocrat, and the boyish, brash everyman like a Matt Damon, right? Or Biggie and Tupac, because these guys did not like each other. Just give you one example. At one point, McReady is giving a performance in Edinburgh, right, of Shakespeare. And Forrest travels all the way to Edinburgh, sits in the front row. And when McReady comes out on the stage and does his little pirouette thing, Forrest boos him, right? Like right there in the front row. Uh, these two guys do not like each other. So with all of that as background, right? The personal rivalry between these two men, but also the fact that they represent not just different nations, but different constituencies within the United States, right? McReady, the preferred Shakespearean actor of the elite, Forrest, the preferred Shakespearean actor of the working class, right? Um, May 7th, 1849, New York City. On that evening, two performances of Macbeth are being delivered in the same city, right? And again, this is just sort of an example of how popular this is, right? That you get two performances of Macbeth, same night, different theaters. At the Astor Place Opera House, which is the opera house that now tends to be favored more by the elite, right? We're beginning to see that division where everyone's still watching Shakespeare, but rich people tend to go to the Astor Place. That sounds like a place rich people do, doesn't it? And so at the Astor Place Opera House, rich folks are coming out to see Charles McReady play Macbeth. Meanwhile, across town at the Broadway Theater, which is a more kind of working class venue, same play, same night, Forrest is playing Macbeth. So these two actors with this huge rivalry playing the same role in the same play in the same city on the same night. Right? So we'll start with the Broadway Theater first, because that's the simplest to talk about. Forrest gives a performance that is an absolute triumph, right? He goes out, he makes his first appearance on the stage as Macbeth, and the largely working class audience stands up and not only gives him a standing ovation, but just yells and screams, and it's like a rock show, like "Thank you, man," like for minutes. Like he gets up, he starts to deliver, and he has to stop because like there's so much applause, it goes on for minutes. It's just absolute triumph. Things went altogether differently for William Charles McReady. Um, Astor Opera House, May 7th, 1849. Um, Before the curtain rises, so people are coming into the theater like an hour early or so to get their seats, and folks are already noticing that the crowd's a little different that night. That usually the crowd is sort of rich folks or well off folks, but there seem to be a lot of people in the crowd that night dressed in kind of rough working man's clothes. It's not the kind of average crowd for the Astor Place Opera House. The play is set to commence at 7:30, and when 7:30 hits, many in the crowd began stomping their feet, right? Like again, the way you would in a rock show. And that's not, even at a highbrow place like the Astor Place, that's not entirely unknown. People love their Shakespeare, right? But this is not a little bit of stamping of feet. This is this just enormous rumble that is getting so loud that it's shaking the walls and making the glass in the chandelier jingle. The actress playing Lady Macbeth is like hearing all of this, right? She's hearing this rumbling and this, the window shaking, and she sort of peeks out the curtain, and she also sees all these kind of rough working class folks out in the audience. And close curtain says, "My God, what's the matter? Are we to be murdered tonight?" At which place the theater manager says, "My dear madam, keep calm. There's no cause for alarm. Everything is going to go smooth. It's going to be fine." And it gets louder and louder, and everyone's looking at McReady behind the scenes, kind of like, "Should we do this? Should we go ahead with this? Maybe we should call this off. This seems the vibes are bad tonight at the Astor Opera House." But McGreedy sort of briefly hesitates. It's like, this does not seem great. But as they say, the show must go on. And so McGreedy gives the signal, and the curtain is pulled back. And for an instant, the crowd is stunned into silence because it's a beautiful stage, beautiful set. Again, this is the rich people's opera house, right? And so it's a beautiful, wonderful, lush set, and this largely working class crowd who has come maybe with not the best of intentions that night still loves theater, and they're briefly stunned. They're like, "Wow, this is a really fucking nice opera house." Um, and for a minute, it seems like things are going to go okay. Um, the first two scenes of the first act go off relatively quietly. But of course, if you know the play at all, Macbeth as a character doesn't appear until the third scene of the first act. And so eventually we get to that point, and McReady enters the stage, um, does his little thing with the twirl and his little cape. And he begins to say the first line, Macbeth's first line in the play, Act 1, Scene 3, line 39. For those keeping track at home, not going to be in the exam. Foul and fair a day I have not seen. And he's not even able to complete that line before the stage is covered in fruit and rotten eggs. Like, this audience has gotten up there yelling, "Get off the stage, you suck, we hate you, boo, hiss," and they're pelting him with fruit and vegetables. Um, Now, McGreedy is not easily intimidated. He may be a kind of foppish looking dude with his little cape, but he's not easily intimidated. And he stands up at the front of the stage, he crosses his arms, and he just tries to stare these folks down. Right? He's like, "You're not going to get me off this stage." And he's just sitting there staring at them. And then someone hits him with a rotten egg, and his whole clothes are covered in rotten eggs. And he's just like, "No, I'm not gonna, I'm gonna face you guys down." And it is that point that someone pulls up a chair and throws it at him, and it just barely misses his head. At that point, even McReady decides there are times when the show cannot, in fact, go on, and he flees behind the curtain. He leaves via a side exit. The crowd is still yelling and screaming, and the theater manager has to come out and write on a chalkboard, "McReady has left the theater." At which point, there's a huge cheer from the working class crowds, and they all spill out into the street to celebrate. Charles McReady has been killed. Now, in some ways, this isn't 100% unprecedented, right? The idea of throwing stuff at a performer. So, just one example: in 1856, in Sacramento, California, there's a performance of Richard III that apparently was not met with particular approval from the audience because, according to a newspaper account, they threw carrots, cabbages, pumpkins, potatoes, a wreath of vegetables, a sack of flour, a sack of suit, and a dead goose onto the stage because they were unhappy with the play. But what makes this different, what makes this particular form of audience participation different, is the kind of underlying dynamics here. One is of nationality, right? McReady is English, but also of class, right? That these are working class Americans protesting not just McReady, but essentially voicing discontent with the entire notion of this kind of upper class rich folks in their theater. Um, Now, McGreedy is like, "I'm out of here. Like, you guys suck. I'm gonna go home." But New York's elite beg him to reconsider. They write him a letter. It's, "Dear sir, the undersigned, having heard that the outrage at the Astor Place Opera House on Monday evening is likely to have the effect of preventing you from continuing performances and from concluding your intended farewell engagement on the American stage, take this public method of requesting you to reconsider your decision and of assuring you that the good sense and respect for order prevailing in this community will sustain you on the subsequent nights of your performance." And signed by a whole bunch of New York's elite. So the author Herman Melville, Washington Irvin, 22 lawyers, 5 editors, a banker, a broker, a ship owner. These are the rich folks of New York, telling McReady, "Please, please come back. We're so sorry about these ruffians and what they did to you." Meanwhile, the working class has their own message. They start putting posters up on the streets of New York. Working men, shall Americans or English rule in the city? The crew of a British steamer, British ship, docked in port, have threatened all Americans who shall dare to offer their opinions this night at the English aristocratic opera house. Right? Notice how it's not just an opera house anymore. Right? This is for people who like England and are rich. Working men, freemen, stand up to your lawful right. So McGreedy gets this letter and he says, okay, I'll come back. I'll do another performance, right? I've been assured that all is going to go well. And so we have this return engagement at the Astor Place, Opera House on May 11th, at which once again, McGreedy is supposed to give his performance of Macbeth. This time they're ready though. There are 300 police officers in and outside of the opera house. 300 police officers at the opera house. And at the door, they're they're doing like the pat down at the door to make sure nobody's bringing in fruits or vegetables or rotten eggs. They're trying to keep out, anyone who doesn't have a ticket. They want to make sure that only respectable people get in. And when the show starts, they close and barricade the door so that nobody else can get in. Despite all the best efforts to keep out, working class toughs, although no fruit is thrown on the stage that night, that people are constantly booing and hissing him throughout the entire performance. You basically cannot hear a single word of his dialogue. Every time McGreedy starts to speak, people are booing and yelling and get off the stage. And the scene outside is even more chaotic. Something on the order of 10,000 to 15,000 people are gathered outside. And when the doors get locked, they start to throw rocks and paving stones at the window. They attack the lamp posts and they break them down. And they start to try to use these lamp posts to sort of breach the doors of the theater. So you've got like 10,000 people, maybe 15,000 people outside throwing rocks and trying to break into the theater. In response, the National Guard is dispatched, led by a group of cavalrymen on horseback. So they literally send the cavalry. And when the rioters see the cavalry coming, instead of being intimidated and running away, they pick up paving stones and they start throwing them at the horses. And horses don't like having stones thrown at them. And so the horses get spooked, and actually the cavalry has to retreat. So literally they force the cavalry to retreat. The infantry then is dispatched. National Guard infantry is dispatched to march on this opera house. On the entire way they are marching, they are being, bottles and rocks and bricks are being thrown at them. And they have to fall back at first, and then eventually they're ordered to regroup and advance. And they finally, under this sort of hail of rocks and bricks and stones, make it up to where the crowd is. And they now have their guns out and their muskets aimed right at this crowd, and they're at point blank range. And the general who is leading them, General Hall, is yelling at the crowd to disperse. The crowd won't disperse, and so since they won't disperse, he gives the order to his men to fire. He yells, "Fire!" And remember, they're at point blank. You have a National Guard point blank, literally with their guns into the chests of these working class rioters. And at first, the National Guard doesn't want to do it. Right? He yells, "Fire!" Only one guy fires at the fringes. And he yells again, "Fire!" And this time maybe 2 or 3 people fire. And finally, he yells, "Fire! Fire! Fire! Fire!" And eventually they do. They let loose a volley, and a bunch of folks fall over dead or wounded. But this doesn't entirely disperse the crowd. They fall back. The crowd falls back, and the crowd rallies and tries to continue to throw things at the National Guard. And which point they are given the order to fire again. On a second volley is fired, and more people fall over, dead or wounded. And eventually the National Guard brings out cannons, and they do succeed in clearing the theater, right? They break up this riot at a cost of 22 killed, 150 injured, and 86 arrested. American blood is being shed by American soldiers in American streets over Shakespeare, over a Shakespeare play. But of course, it's really not just about Shakespeare. It's about much more than that. It's partially about nationalism, right? It's about these working class Americans offended at this British actor. And it's about class, right? It's about New York's elite saying, you working class you don't get to cancel you don't get to cancel him. Um, we will have order in this city, and if we have to shed blood to do it, we will, right? Philip Hone, the next day, who is a merchant and a former New York City mayor, puts it like this: although the lesson has been dearly bought, it is of great value, insomuch as the fact has been established that law and order can be maintained under a republican form of government. Right? You know, this is again something that would not be unusual coming out of the mouth of Donald Trump, right? This idea that, hey, gotta have law and order. We gotta kill people to do it. What we gotta do. Meanwhile, across town, there's a working man's rally to sort of mourn the dead, mourn and bury their dead. And one of the speakers says, fellow citizens, for whom was this murder committed? Was it done for the sake of justice and the good object of preserving order? No, no, I think not. For what then was it done? To please the aristocracy of the city at the expense of the lives of unoffending citizens. To please an aristocratic Englishman backed by a few sycophantic Americans. To revenge the aristocrats of the city against the working classes. The New York correspondent for the Philadelphia paper writes the following in the aftermath: it leaves behind a feeling to which this community has hitherto been a stranger, an opposition of classes, rich and poor, a feeling that there is now in our country, in New York City, what every good patriot hitherto has considered it his duty to deny, a high and a low class. Now, and what we are seeing here, what we're seeing in the Astor Place riot and its aftermath, is a reflection of the kind of larger political and economic changes that I talked about with the Industrial Revolution, right? There were obviously economic consequences there, but also consequences in the realm of culture as we create and politics, as we create essentially what is beginning to look like a permanent American working class that has little in common with its overlords. And we see this playing out with Shakespeare, right? As we get further and further along in the 19th century, by the time we get to the start of the 20th century, Shakespeare had been converted. By the early 20th century, Shakespeare had been converted from a popular playwright whose dramas were the property of everybody, um, and converted into a sacred author who had to be protected from ignorant audiences and overbearing actors like Forrest. Um, and we see increasingly the notion of a kind of high culture. Shakespeare needs to be high culture that rich people can appreciate. And we can't let these working class toughs into these Shakespeare plays, because look at how they act, right? And something like Shakespeare that was once a symbol of a kind of, hey, we may be rich, we may be poor, but we all love Shakespeare. Shakespeare and the theater become kind of mirror for the class divisions that have been brought about by the market revolution and the industrial revolution. And the same thing happens in other areas as well. Opera, this is, again, I'll show you this sort of percentage of wealth have it. And what you're seeing with Shakespeare is the kind of the cultural fallout. The Astor Place riot is the cultural fallout and actually real, bloodshed that is the result of these divisions. Opera, another perfect example. Opera, like Shakespeare, was not originally seen as something that was, upper class or a sacred text. Opera was pop culture for a very long time, and it was performed by artists who felt free to embellish, to alter, subtract. It wasn't like, oh, this is the sacred text of this particular German opera, and I have to perform it note for note and word for word. It was no, like, this is this cool German opera, but we're going to change the words to make it more American, and we'll put it on, with you get to see some monkeys or when you come watch it. Same with classical music, we today call classical music. So I give an example. On 1842, a number of young musicians arrived from Germany, and their idea was to introduce Americans to the wonders of classical German music. Right? They were the Germania Musical Society, and they were going to play Bach and Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven and Mendelssohn and Wagner. But they were presented on the same bill with an African monkey, and this is not, I should be very clear, these are not racial slurs. This is an actual monkey from Africa, and several Chinese dogs, actual dogs, right? And much like Peele's museum, right? Like, hey, come for the Beethoven, but hey, look, we got monkeys and dogs. Look at these dogs. These dogs are so cute. Look at this second pupper, right? This was not at all uncommon in the first half of the 19th century, but it's starting to change, right? And classical music and opera and Shakespeare are going to increasingly become um, activities for the elite. And the working class will get their own culture, right? Those movies, increasingly, things like when we get movies become a working class cultural thing. And so this is a way of tying for you some of the larger political and economic changes into some of the cultural changes for facing the United States in this period. So I'm gonna stop with this, and I'll see you for a second lecture shortly.